I was out there with a camera bag riding shotgun and a thermos of coffee in the cup holder, because driving along the Oregon coast in late November is typically breathtaking, with an endless stretch of ocean to one side, dense evergreen forests pressing in on the other, and mist hanging low like some sort of veil. I had always used photography as an escape, and a storm was approaching from the Pacific. Some amazing photos would be produced by the churning surf and overcast skies. The forecast had warned of heavy rain and strong winds, but I'd been through worse. Late in the afternoon, as the clouds grew thicker and the light faded, I noticed a narrow gravel road branching off towards what appeared to be an old abandoned viewpoint. It wasn't on my map, but the angle of the ocean looked promising, so I turned onto the path, tires crunching over wet gravel, and the road snaked downward into a secluded clearing with an old picnic table and a crumbled stone barrier overlooking the sea. I parked and stepped out into the salting air, and even though the wind was getting stronger and fat raindrops were already beginning to fall, I was able to get a few pictures. Before the rain became too heavy to keep my lens dry, dark waves crashed violently against the jagged rocks below. Once I was back in the car, I realized my mistake. The gravel path had turned muddy under the relentless rain, and as I tried to back up, my wheels spun uselessly, leaving me stuck. I muttered, "Stay calm," gripping the wheel. My phone had no signal, which was not surprising in this situation. I had supplies, a full tank of gas, snacks, a blanket, and a rain poncho in case. An hour later, as darkness began to engulf the coastline, I saw headlights coming from the main road. Relief swept over me as a big, weather-beaten pickup truck rolled into the clearing, came to a stop a short distance away, and a man in a heavy raincoat climbed out. Hood pulled low over his face. "You stuck?" He called over the roar of the wind, and I cracked my window just an inch. "Yes, wheels are spinning in the mud." "Do you have a tow rope?" he said, stepping closer, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. "You'd be better off coming with me back to town. I can drop you at a motel." There was something in his voice that made me pause, and his posture, half turned towards his truck as if blocking my view, didn't feel right either. "I think I'll stay here for now," I said, trying to sound polite but firm. "I've got supplies. I'll wait it out." The man didn't move, and rainwater dripped from the edge of his hood, and his face was obscured by shadows. "Storm is getting worse," he said softly. "You sure you want to be out here all night?" I forced a smile. "I'll be all right." "Really, thanks for stopping," though there was a long silence before he gave a single nod and turned back toward his truck, but he didn't leave. Instead of driving off, he walked slowly around the front of my car, his hand trailing lightly across the hood. It wasn't a casual glance or a mechanic's inspection, it felt deliberate, like he was marking something. I locked my doors and watched him through the side mirror. When he finally got back into his truck, I let out a shaky breath, but the relief was short-lived. The truck didn't leave. Its headlights stayed on, illuminated my rearview mirror with blinding light. The engine idled, and every so often I'd hear it rev slightly as if he was testing the gas pedal. I turned off my interior lights and sank low in my seat, clutching my phone. Even though it was useless without service, I debated running, but where would I go? The rain was torrential, and I had no idea how far I'd have to walk to find help. The truck stayed there for what felt like hours. My eyes burned from staring at the mirror, from the strain of waiting, of trying to figure out what his next move would be. Then, just as suddenly as he'd appeared, the truck's engine roared and it backed out of the clearing. The red glow of taillights faded into the dark storm, but I wasn't relieved, not yet. I stayed in my car until the first light of dawn broke through the thinning clouds. The area was a swampy mess after the rain ceased. I noticed them after getting out of my car and looking about. He had around my car several times, pausing at each window and door, leaving behind deep, obvious footprints in the dirt. Taking a deep breath, I looked around the trees, half expecting to find him still there, observing me. Without wasting any more time, I was able to extricate my car from the muck and wedge pebbles and sticks under my tires for traction. I continued until I came to a diner back on the main highway. The waitress asked me what had occurred after noticing how disturbed I looked, and I told her about the vehicle, the man, and the route. She said softly, "You're lucky," after he had circled my car and remained there all night. There have been stories about a truck like that getting stuck on back roads after being approached by a man offering to give them a ride, but the people who accept don't always return. I clutch my coffee cup, my hands shaking. I haven't stopped exploring remote areas and I still chase storms for the perfect shot, but now I travel with a satellite phone, emergency flares, and extra precautions because the most dangerous thing isn't the weather, but rather the people who know how to hide inside it before the next story unfolds. When you spend the majority of your days surrounded by the noise of heavy machinery and the incessant buzz of talk on construction sites, you begin to hear these terrible stories. If you're new to the channel, be sure to subscribe so that you don't miss any of them. Don't get me wrong, I crave silence. I enjoy working with my crew to build homes from the ground up, but occasionally I need to get away from the noise, both real and imagined. For this reason, a few winters ago, I reserved a secluded lodge in the Sierra Nevada mountains, far from the city lights, where the world is covered in snow and the silence is almost tangible. A storm was in the forecast, but honestly that made it all the more appealing. A warm lodge, a roaring fireplace, and snow piling up outside perfect. I arrived late in the afternoon. The sky was already bruised with heavy clouds and snowflakes had started their lazy descent. The driveway leading to the lodge was buried under inches of untouched snow, so I had to park down by the main road and haul my bags uphill. The lodge itself was stunning, rustic yet well kept, perched on a small ridge overlooking a valley. A key was left in the lockbox by the door. Stepping inside, though, I noticed something odd. It was colder than I expected. The heating system was running, but faintly, like it had been left on a low setting for days. I shrugged it off, dropped my bags, and went to start a fire in the old stone fireplace. That's when I noticed the second odd thing: dirty dishes piled in the sink, a couple of mugs, a plate, and a greasy frying pan. Maybe the cleaning crew was in a rush, I muttered to myself, trying to shake off the unease creeping in. After washing them quickly, I moved on, but the weirdness didn't stop. When I went to pack in the bedroom, I noticed the bed looked lit and the sheets were rumpled, the pillow slightly indented. I pressed my hand against the mattress. It was warm. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe the heating vents were positioned just right. Maybe it was just residual warmth. Either way, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been there recently. Still, I pushed those thoughts aside. I prepared my own dinner, poured a large glass of whiskey, and settled down by the fire with an old paperback outside as the storm started to rage. Snow was slapping against the windows, and the wind was howling through the pines. It was around midnight when I heard a faint creak, which I initially dismissed because it was an old lodge, and everything shifts and houses settle. Then, there was another sound, softer this time, almost like a footstep. I took out my flashlight from my bag and proceeded through the dimly lit rooms, locking the doors and sealing the windows. The snow was smooth and undisturbed, leaving no footprints. Though sleep came in short, jittery bursts, I ultimately went back to bed after convincing myself it was the wind or a tree limb scraping against the siding. The storm had passed by the following morning. I stepped out onto the porch with a mug of coffee to let the cold air clear the fog in my head as sunlight filtered weakly through the clouds, casting a pale glow over the snow-covered valley. That's when I noticed the footprints. They began at the back door, sharp and distinct in the fresh snow, and they led away from the lodge and into the woods outside of my valley. Twisted, I put down my mug and followed the prints around the side of the building. They weren't haphazard, they moved purposefully, stopping at windows and doors. Before it dawned on me that whoever had left the tracks hadn't come around during the night. They hadn't been leftovers from a careless cleaning crew. They had been hiding in the lodge when I got there, waiting until I was asleep to slip out into the storm. I stood there for a long time, staring at those tracks as they vanished into the woods. My mind raced with questions I didn't want answers to. I called the property manager immediately. Their apology was almost frantic, stared out between excuses and reassurances. No one should have been there. They said the place was supposed to be empty for weeks. Then the woman on the phone added something else, hesitating. First, the doors, they all have heavy manual locks on the inside. They can't be opened from the outside, not without a key. Just lock them all before you go to bed tonight, okay? It wasn't comforting, not in the slightest. Still, I spent the rest of the afternoon securing every window, every door. The lodge was old, but those locks were sturdy, industrial grade, the kind you'd expect in a bank vault rather than a vacation rental. That night the wind picked up again. Snowflakes tapped against the glass like tiny fingertips, and the fire crackled softly in the hearth. I sat by the window, a hunting knife on the table beside me and my flashlight within arm's reach. I barely slept. Every creak, every gust of wind had me snapping my head up, eyes locked on the shadows shifting across the floor. By sunrise that weekend changed me. Now, whenever I rent a cabin, lodge, or any remote getaway, I check every closet, every attic hatch, every lock, and every window latch, because, in these remote places where you expect peace and solitude, you're never really as alone as you think you are. Sometimes the scariest part isn't knowing someone could be out there, but realizing they already were. Before the next story, I had had enough. I packed my bags, double-checked the locks, and left without calling the property manager again. I drove down the winding mountain road and kept looking in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone standing at the tree line watching me leave. Make sure to subscribe if you're new to the channel so you don't miss any of these harrowing tales. In Alaska, winter storms are common, and most people are able to withstand significant snowfall, even when it falls in thick, blinding sheets. I've been living alone in this small cabin for about 5 years. It's tucked away in the woods, far enough from town to enjoy the peace and quiet, but close enough that the drive doesn't feel like an adventure. That night, however, something felt different. It was Friday, late December 2017. And I had closed my store early, telling my employees to head home before the roads became impassable. By the time I pulled into my driveway, the snow had already piled up, engulfing the outlines of my property. I shoveled just enough to get inside, locked up, and turned on the heater. The wind howled, rattling the old window panes, but the sound was strangely soothing. I made cocoa and settled into my recliner, the kind that leans too far back. It was looking like it would be one of those peaceful, comfortable evenings that I had come to love if you're not careful and watch a documentary about glaciers. But at midnight there came a knock. I put down my mug and went to the window, pulling the curtain aside just a bit because I was frozen in the middle of a sip, staring at the front door. The snow outside blurred everything under the dim light of the torch, but something caught my eye. Fresh boot prints that led up to my door and back down the steps. Whoever it was had knocked and gone, and I stood there for a moment with my hand hovering over the deadbolt because there was no way I was going to open that door. The prints were sharp-edged, no snow had filled them in, but they were fresh. I stayed there until my breath fogged up the glass, locked the door once more, and made myself go back to my recliner. An hour later, the second knock came from the side of the house, right next to the kitchen window. My stomach lurched as I reached for the flashlight I kept by the door. The kitchen window was frosted over, blocking my view, but I could tell the snow underneath it was unharmed. I turned off the kitchen light and used it to scan the yard. Snowflakes danced in the light, swirling violently in the wind, but after a while, I convinced myself it had been a branch or perhaps even the storm playing tricks, but deep down I knew better. I checked every window and lock before going to bed, flashlight still in my hand. The third knock woke me just before 3 o'clock in the morning. This one came from the sliding glass door leading to my deck, and it was sharp and loud. I sat up, trying to hear the wind howling, and I moved cautiously down the hallway, using the flashlight to see through the darkness. The sliding door was locked, as I had ensured earlier, but the curtain was open beyond the glass, and the deck was covered in pristine snow with no footprints or tracks. However, for the remainder of the night, the knocks persisted, coming from the front door, the back deck, and the side window. At one point, I thought I heard faint footsteps crunching in the snow, but when I looked, I saw nothing but the storm. There was no way I was going outside, not in that blizzard, and definitely not when something was outside. I spent the rest of the night in the living room, with the flashlight trembling slightly in my hand. When dawn finally arrived, the storm had subsided, leaving a pale overcast sky, and the silence outside felt deafening. I wrapped myself in my thickest coat and went outside my boots. At first, everything appeared normal as I sank deep into the snow, but as I moved around the cabin, I noticed footprints. Whoever made them had circled my house multiple times, weaving between windows and doors and stopping at each entrance. What worried me the most, though, was where the LED tracks at the edge of my property merged with something else, tire tracks or a snowmobile. Its tread's faint impression twisted toward the trees. When I got back to the house, I called the police, and 2 officers arrived. The younger guy looked skeptical, but when I mentioned the snowmobile tracks, his expression changed. The older officer didn't even hesitate, saying that there were many kids riding snowmobiles during a blizzard at night. He said they followed the tracks for a short while but returned after 15 minutes, the snow having all but erased them. I squatted down, brushing away a thin layer of snow, and the tracks weren't fresh, they had begun to bury them. Whoever it was, the older officer said they knew what they were doing. This wasn't random. What do you think they wanted? I asked. He hesitated. Could have been someone looking for shelter, or maybe they just wanted to scare you. But the way he said it, I could tell he didn't believe that either. After they left, I couldn't shake the image of those foot circling my home, the snowmobile waiting just beyond the trees. Whoever it was, they had been deliberate. They had known exactly what they were doing by mid-afternoon. I made a decision. I drove into town straight to the nearest gun store. I'd never owned a firearm before, but that day I left with a 9mm handgun, a hunting rifle, and enough ammunition to feel prepared. The clerk's parting words echoed in my head on the drive home. Don't go looking for trouble, but make sure you're ready if it finds you. That night I slept with a handgun on my nightstand and the rifle propped by the front door. I wasn't going to let fear turn my home into a prison I still love. The stillness of winter storms, the way they blanket the world in quiet, but now I see them differently. They're not just peaceful, they're a veil, a cover for someone lurking just beyond the edge of the tree line, and if they ever come back, I'll be ready this time.